There is a statement that sounds simple, too simple for some, too childlike for scholars, too gentle for the loud, too quiet for the proud, yet it is the very heartbeat of every miracle I ever witnessed. Faith always works. Not sometime, not occasionally, not when the conditions are right, not when the atmosphere feels charged, not when you feel confident, not when the crowd is large, not when you have strength. Faith always works because God always honors it. Faith is not a feeling. Faith is not emotion. Faith is not optimism. Faith is not mental strength. Faith is not hype. Faith is not noise. Faith is the quiet decision to believe God when everything around you dares you not to. And every miracle I saw, every healing, every deliverance, every breakthrough did not begin with me. It began with faith in the heart of someone desperate enough to believe. The miracle in Los Angeles that taught me this truth. It was in Los Angeles, a night when the Shrine Auditorium was filled to overflowing. The atmosphere was electric. The choir was singing softly. My body was weak, but the Holy Spirit rested heavily upon the room. And then I saw her, a little woman, in the 5th row from the front, wearing a faded blue dress, hands trembling with expectation. Her eyes were locked on me, but she was not looking at me. She was looking through me. She saw not Kathryn, but the God she believed was about to heal her. Her body was twisted from arthritis. One arm curled inward, her back bent, her fingers stiff. Doctors had told her nothing could be done, but she stood there, shaking, whispering to herself, if I can just get into the presence, God will do it. I know He will. I know He will. And in that moment, standing on that stage, the Holy Spirit whispered to me, faith always works. Not because of the woman, not because of the meeting, not because of the preacher, but because faith has only one object, God Himself. And God has never failed. That night, right there in the 5th row, with no spotlight, no music, no attention. Her arms straightened, her fingers loosened, her back aligned, strength surged through her body, and she collapsed into tears. Not because she felt power, but because she realized faith works, because God works. Faith is not magic, it is agreement. Faith does not manipulate God. Faith does not control God. Faith does not force God. Faith agrees with Him. Faith says, God, you are right. Your word is true. Your promise stands. Your power is enough. Your presence is here. Your nature cannot fail. Faith is simply the soul standing tall and saying yes to what God already intended to do. This is why faith is powerful, because God is faithful. The Pittsburgh miracle that proved faith is never too small. In Pittsburgh, at the Syria Mosque, a man attended one of my meetings who had battled heart failure for years. Doctors told him his heart could stop at any moment. He could barely walk, barely breathe, barely stand. But he had one thing left, a tiny shred of faith. He whispered to his wife before the service, I don't have enough strength to be healed, but maybe I have enough faith for Him to touch me. Little did he know, faith does not need to be strong. It simply needs to be faith. Jesus never said, great faith moves mountains. We have to send, He said, faith the size of a mustard seed moves mountain, because it is not the size of the faith, but the size of the God. During the service, before I even reached his section, he suddenly stood up, eyes wide, hands trembling. His wife screamed softly. What's happening? All he said was, He touched me. That night, his heart beat, strong and steady, for the first time in years. Why? Because faith always works when it meets the presence of the one who cannot lie. Why faith fails for some people. It is not because God ignores them. It is not because the promise is delayed. It is not because miracles are selective. Faith fails only when we expect God to move according to our timeline instead of His wisdom. faith fails. When people believe with their mind rather than their spirit, faith fails. When people look at symptoms more than Jesus, faith fails. When people want results more than they want God, but when faith is pure, when faith is simple, when faith is childlike, when faith leans on his nature, when faith rests on his word, nothing can stop it. The 3 secrets behind faith operating in my meetings. If I could summarize everything I ever learned about faith, everything I ever witnessed, everything I ever tasted, it would be these 3 secrets. Secret 1, faith works best in weak people. Faith does not thrive in the strong. It thrives in the broken. When your strength is gone, faith becomes louder. When your understanding fails, faith becomes wiser. When your emotions collapse, faith becomes steady. Most of the miracles I witnessed came through people who had nothing left but belief. God does his strongest work in people who feel utterly weak, because weakness is the doorway through which faith walks. Secret 2, faith works where atmosphere is open. Faith is not loud. Faith listens. Faith listens to God, not to symptoms. Faith listens to his whisper, not to fear. Faith listens to his nature, not to human opinion. In my meetings, I protected the atmosphere fiercely, because when the atmosphere is pure, faith grows like fire. When the atmosphere is distracted, faith becomes suffocated. When the atmosphere is reverent, faith becomes bold. You cannot produce miracles in a room full of pride, but in a room full of surrender, faith explodes. Secret 3, faith works when the Spirit is the one leading. This is the greatest secret. Faith fails when humans lead the service. Faith works when the Holy Spirit leads. Not emotions, not strategy, not performance, not pressure. I followed him like a child holding a father's hand. He would whisper, call that person, stop the music, wait, move now, say nothing, lay hands, don't touch anyone, turn left, turn right, be silent. And because the leadership was his, the miracles were his. Faith is simply obedience that refuses to argue. The miracle in Denver that made me weep for hours, it was in Denver, Colorado. On a cold evening where the wind danced against the windows of the auditorium, a man had been brought in on a stretcher, paralyzed from the waist down after a car accident. Doctors said the nerves were irreparably damaged. He lay quietly in the back, unable to move, unable to feel his legs, but he had faith, not loud faith, not emotional faith, not desperate faith, just quiet, still, absolute trust. Halfway through the meeting, I felt a tug of the Spirit. Call the man on the stretcher. They rolled him to the front. The entire room went silent. I said nothing, absolutely nothing, because the Spirit wanted no performance, no technique, no showmanship. I simply pointed at him and whispered, Jesus. At that moment, in full view of thousands, the man's legs began to tremble uncontrollably. First gently, then violently, then with a sudden cry that ripped through the auditorium, he sat up, and then he stood, and then he walked, and then he ran, and I fell to my knees in tears. Not because the miracle was great, but because faith had done exactly what it always does. It worked because God always honors faith. The night I had no strength, but faith healed thousands. There was a night, I remember it vividly, when I was so physically weak, I could hardly stand. My heart fluttered, my hands trembled, my legs felt hollow, my breath short. I leaned on a podium behind the curtain, weeping softly. Holy Spirit, I cannot do this tonight. And he whispered back, you don't have to. Faith will do it. I walked onto the stage with barely enough strength to hold the microphone. But in the next 90 minutes, more miracles happened than any other night that year. blind eyes, cancer, heart disease, tumors, deaf ears, wheelchairs, depression, demons. It was as if God said, when your strength ends, my faith begins. This is why I tell people, faith always works, even when you don't. Because faith does not depend on your power. It depends on His faithfulness. The difference between faith in miracles and faith in God, this is where many fail. People say, I believe for healing. I believe for provision. I believe for breakthrough. I believe for a miracle. But true faith does not believe for a miracle. True faith believes in God. Miracles are the fruit. God is the root. People who want miracles seek the hand of God. People who want Him seek His face. One produces temporary experiences. The other produces permanent transformation. Faith is not in what God does. Faith is in who God is. And because He cannot fail, faith cannot fail. The prophetic truth this generation must hear. There is a deception sweeping across this generation. People want results, not relationship. They want signs, not surrender. They want power, not presence. They want miracles, but not the maker. And that is why their faith feels weak, because faith cannot grow in a heart that seeks God's gifts more than God Himself. The Holy Spirit told me, tell them, faith works when they return to me, not to hype, not to emotions, not to excitement, not to manifestations, but to Him. The woman who was healed while dying. There was a night in Youngstown, Ohio, that remains the most heart-shattering, awe-inspiring moment of faith I ever witnessed. A woman had been brought in from the hospital that morning. Cancer had eaten through her body. She weighed almost nothing. Her skin was pale, her breathing shallow, her eyes sunken, but strangely bright. The doctor said she had less than 24 hours to live. Yet she begged her family, take me to the meeting. If I die, let me die in the presence. And she arrived in a wheelchair, barely conscious. Her head slumped sideways, eyes half closed, breath rattling softly. I saw her, but more importantly, God saw her faith. Halfway through the service, while I was speaking on the love of God, her body suddenly jolted, her head lifted, her eyes widened. Her daughter screamed, thinking she was dying. But the Spirit whispered to me, no, she is living. And right there, in the middle of the crowd, with death gripping her lungs, with no prayer line, no touch, no instruction, the presence washed over her like a flood. She stood up, not slowly, not weakly. She stood up like a woman waking from sleep. Her daughter fainted. People began to cry. She walked to the front with tears streaming down her cheeks and whispered, all I said was, I know you can. No complex faith, no long prayer, no intense effort, just this. I know you can, and God did, because faith always works when it is anchored in God's ability, not ours. The revelation that changed my life forever. It happened one night in a hotel room after a meeting where miracles exploded like fireworks. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands trembling, still overwhelmed by what God had done. And the Holy Spirit whispered, Kathryn, faith is not a power you release. Faith is trust in my nature. I froze. He continued, faith works because I do not change. Faith works because my character is perfect. Faith works because my word is eternal. Faith works because my will is good. Then he said the sentence that redefined my entire ministry. Faith does not make me move. Faith reveals that I was moving all along. I wept until my chest hurt because it was true. Faith doesn't push God. It aligns with God. It doesn't force heaven. It agrees with heaven. Faith is the soul saying, God is who He says He is. And that alone releases miracles. The prophetic cry of the Holy Spirit for this generation The Holy Spirit is crying out to this generation. Return to faith, not faith in money, not faith in talent, not faith in connections, not faith in systems, not faith in trends, not faith in influencers. Faith in God, the one who heals, the one who sees, the one who knows, the one who answers, the one who cannot lie, the one who cannot fail. The Spirit is calling you back to the kind of faith that does not negotiate with symptoms or argue with circumstances. A faith that stands tall in hospital rooms and says, I know God can. A faith that whispers in financial storms, He is able. A faith that declares in hopeless darkness, light is coming. A faith that shouts into depression, God is still faithful. A faith that faces impossible walls and says, move, because faith is the breath of heaven, speaking through human lips, the final call to every soul listening. If I could pour one thing into your spirit today, if I could leave you one truth, greater than miracles, greater than testimonies, greater than any message I ever preached, it would be this: faith is never wasted. Not one prayer goes unheard. Not one tear goes unnoticed. Not one whisper goes ignored. Not one step of trust is forgotten. God remembers every moment you believed Him, when everything in life told you not to, and He will honor it. Faith always works because God always watches. Faith always works because God cannot lie. Faith always works because God never abandoned. Faith always works because God always finishes what He starts. Faith always works because God always does